This is another What We Read video.
That's
where
right.
we discuss the things that we have recently read.
All right, let's get into it.
This particular What We Read, I am going to be focusing on one specific author. I'm going to be talking about all 6 of Jane Austen's finished works because I finally read everything.
Ooh.
Okay, so we'll start with
Part 1.
We'll start with part 1, which is 3 of her books. So first is a reread, Sense and Sensibility. This is about Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood. They're sisters who love each other and their mother and other sister very dearly, but they have very different personalities. Marianne is the type to wear her heart on her sleeve and be very emotional, whereas Eleanor kind of holds her cards close to her chest. And the story kind of follows the 2 sisters and their romantic entanglements, and they both discover that they might need a little bit of sense as well as sensibility in order to make relationships work.
Yep.
I have read this one multiple times. I believe this was my 4th time rereading it, and this was the first time I had listened to it on audio though, and that was a fun experience. The version of the audio that I listened to was narrated by Juliet Stevenson, and I think she is perfect for narrating Jane Austen's works. I just love the story a lot because I enjoy seeing the antics of Marianne as well as the responses from Eleanor. I've always admired the sister relationship in this story and how supportive they are of each other, even though they have very different opinions about how to react or, you know, act in certain situations.
That's right.
Even though I knew all of the things that were coming, I still got swept up in the drama of everything, which was always really fun. I mean, it does help that the sisters kind of remind me of me and my sister, so I'm kind of like, this seems oddly familiar. But yeah, it was a joy just to revisit this story again and to just have it reconfirmed that I really do like this book a lot, you know. The other one that I reread, and this was the first time I had reread it in like years, was Pride and Prejudice. And it was also the first time I had listened to it on audiobook. Again, I picked one that was narrated by Juliet Stevenson. I mean, a lot of people will know the premise of the story, but just in case you didn't, when Elizabeth Bennet meets Mr. Darcy, she kind of doesn't like his attitude, because he does have one. But their paths keep crossing because his friend Bingley has a thing for her sister Jane. And soon it becomes clear to both of them that they're going to have to overturn both their Pride and Prejudice in order to have some semblance of, you know, camaraderie between them.
Very well
or
put.
more. I had forgotten how much I liked Pride and Prejudice, and I'd always thought that I loved Sense and Sensibility more than Pride and Prejudice, and I now see that was incorrect. Because the thing that I love the most about Pride and Prejudice that I had completely forgotten about is how sassy Lizzie Bennet is.
I mean,
she is just like whip smart and witty, and I enjoy her dynamic with Darcy so much, including the part where she realizes that she might have been wrong about a few things.
Well,
you know, and regrets all of that. There's such angst there, and I love it. I'm living for it. I love that this story really dismantles the character personalities. Like, the plot is very similar to most of Jane Austen's work, where it's like young women who are taking part of or being introduced into society and sort of the relationships that form whether or not they are ill-advised or not. And I liked this one in particular just because I feel like Lizzie is very different from a lot of the other heroines. Like, she has a lot of feelings, but she's also very strong-willed. And it's just fun to just watch the story play out, even though you know exactly how it's going to play out. That, like, I still had all of the feels when all of the big moments happened in it, so I definitely had fun rereading this one, and I'm glad that I finally got to it.
There we go.
The one that I read after that is actually one of the longer Austen novels, and it was one I had read for the first time. It's Mansfield Park.
Mansfield, oh yeah, okay.
So this one is about Fanny Price, and at a young age she's taken from her parents and her siblings, and she is brought to live with her rich cousins at Mansfield Park. And the only cousin that she really gets along with, the only one that's kind of an ally to her, is her cousin Edmund. When her uncle goes away to handle some business in Antigua, the Crawford family actually arrives in the neighborhood, and they sort of stir things up with their London sensibilities. Again, this is another one where it's all about like the characters and their relationships with each other and like the ups and downs of that. But this is actually my least favorite of the Austen novels that I have, well, the least favorite of the Austen novels in general. I think it's just because I was a little frustrated with Fanny, and that is probably because I read this one right after the other two, where the characters are kind of, they have more agency and they're a little more independent, whereas Fanny is a little more dependent and reliant on the
Yeah, she
others,
was
and she's a
very-
little quieter.
Yeah, she was
she's more
very
reserved.
assertive.
This is not to say like she doesn't have her moments. She does, but like it was kind of a drag to hear about everyone treating her so badly and just being so oblivious to the state she was living in, or like the
Yeah.
feeling she was having. And I think that was just hard for me because I'm just like, I just don't want her to. I just don't want to be sad, and it's hard not to be sad for Fanny with all of the things that she's going through and the things she denies herself because she feels like she has to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? With her rank and like everything. I mean, it does end in a very satisfying way where I'm like, finally everyone got what was coming to them, but like,
and that's the journey,
it's
right?
so long and drawn out, and it's really hard and sort of sad most of the time. So, you know, this was probably my least. Yeah, this is definitely my least favorite of the Austen novels. All right, mini Austen break from Mikey to talk about his.
Speaking of long and drawn out, I have been working on these books for literally over a year now, I think, almost. And the one common theme that all of these three books have, for me personally, is... So they are all books within a series, whether the last one or somewhere in the middle, right? And for me, the reason why it took me forever to finish these books is because it's sort of... For every single one of them, it divorced me, the specific reader, right? It doesn't diminish how good they actually are sort of by themselves, but me personally, it divorced me from the sort of the reason why I loved them, or the series in the first place. So we'll start with the Adventurers Guild Book 3, the conclusion to the Adventurers Guild series by Zach Lauren Clark and Nick Eliopoulos. I mean, I had not heard of a book 4, but this seemed like a pretty good,
I think
good ending, because you just can't get any bigger than this. And if you can, great, but it just feels like it felt like a trilogy. I was expecting more. I don't know why I was expecting more. Maybe because middle grade books are usually in the 5s now or something like that. But this was a solid trilogy, I think. I could be wrong. And it centers around a town that or city that just happens to be in a post-apocalyptic, like whatever passes for post-apocalyptic in medieval fantasy. That's what this is. The whole world was overrun by a bunch of evil creatures that they just call dangers, right?
Sure.
And the city now has guilds that sort of help the city sort of like survive. So then you have the Adventurers Guild, which sort of like they're knights. Their adventurers are the ones who go out of the city to face these dangers and bring back valuable supplies, etc. like that. Centers on two characters, best friends, Brock and Zed. One of them is sort of like half elf and has always been,
yes, I remember
sort of like the object of scrutiny, and he's got no place except with his best friend, who happens to sort of be merchant spawn but also has shady connections to like the underworld. And they both get drafted for the Adventurers Guild, and shenanigans ensue. The reason why I did not like the last book as much was because, again, I don't want to spoil it, but something happens where the core of the story is two friends and their friendship. If something gets in between that and they can't be like best friends at the center of this anymore for most of the book, I'm just like, it just makes me feel uncomfortable, and much like
oh man.
so it doesn't make it bad, but very much like the Mansfield Park analogy, where it's just like I don't want to see this. It turned out great, I guess. That's
sad.
It turned out great. I mean, I liked it. I thought, all right, we have this in hardbound somewhere in the house that I can't find it.
I have no idea where.
And it's great. So it does give a pretty satisfying sort of ending to it as well. It's just it took forever because I just didn't like where it was going. It was terrible, and whatever trope that they used, valid, I must say, and well written, I will also say, but palette-wise, not something that I would sort of sink my teeth in. And clearly it took forever for me to finish this.
Yep.
Which leads me to, again, same thing. This is Brandon Mull's Dragonwatch series. It is, I want to say, it is to the Fablehaven series what Rick Riordan's Heroes of Olympus is to Percy Jackson, where in Fablehaven you have two siblings, the Sorensens, and they, discover that their grandparents are actually the caretakers of this mystical preserve called Fablehaven, where mythical creatures all over the world are sort of like corralled into these mythical preserves so that they don't overrun humanity. And whilst something terrible and huge sort of like world threat was over trying to overtake the whole world in the Fablehaven series, the aftermath of that conflict gave birth to sort of like the Dragonwatch series, where suddenly all over the place dragons who are also part of being sort of corralled. There are dragon sanctuaries apart from, I think, mythical preserves. They're like, we don't want that. We're not going to take it like anymore. Cue song. Again, what threw me off with this book was coming from the tail end of the last book, where you've got two siblings. They are the core of this thing, and that's why I love this series. I did not care for them individually apart from each other more than I cared about them as a unit. And that's just me, right? So it didn't work for me when that sort of like dynamic was sort of like disrupted. Rightfully so, it made for some interesting storytelling.
Sure.
Again, I felt like it was written pretty well, but again, it lost me. And so I had to inch my way all the way through. I had to read this book through doctor's appointments in the waiting room, just because like it had to be those circumstances. Like I couldn't be bothered to pick it up and read it on my own time.
It says a lot about that.
Which says a lot about, like, so because I loved the whole brother and sister sort of tandem. It was them, they were a team, and then suddenly they were not.
And then suddenly it was gone.
And in fact, I don't know how they're going to land the 5th book. This is book 4, because even if things may have resolved themselves, sort of, the whole dual agenda thing, I feel didn't branch out as organically as I would have liked or I would have preferred.
Sure.
And that's just a me problem, I find. It's still a pretty well-written middle grade fantasy. Very, very epic, I want to say. In scale, lots of deep world building, which is fascinating all around. It's just, again, I feel like for me, it's they're losing me in terms of what I latched onto the series for. So there's that. Last, but certainly not least, and also took some random finagling on how I got here, is Obsidio. Finally, I caught up. I've read it. I was the first one to read. I was the first one to read Illuminae and Gemina, which were spectacular. I don't know why it took me forever.
I'm still laughing about that.
I don't know why it took me.
I know. I have a theory. Sorry.
Okay, what's the theory?
Anyway, so before we get to the theory, Obsidio is the 3rd book in the Illuminae files by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff.
Yes.
It's basically a huge epic space opera type story. In the first book, you find a bunch of people fleeing a planet, right? They're fleeing a planet because a corporation has actually decided
liquidated it.
Yeah, basically. And so that's the first story. The second story is actually the space station that those people are fleeing towards.
Because they were going to have to liquidate that space station too.
Yes. And this 3rd book takes us back to the planet that was supposedly liquidated and the people who remain on that planet. The reason I think Maki had to take a step back is because the very beginning of this book is actually written in a more traditional storytelling style where it's more narrative, it's more diary entry or whatever. It's it's less of the mixed media stuff.
Yeah.
And also it's the characters are not as immediately likable or immediately engaging as the other 4 characters are. Anyway, that was my 2 cents. Now it's time for my
And she's absolutely right, because
because it was the same reasons I didn't
because what happened with Illuminae and Gemina was that you were able to immediately latch on to me. I was able to immediately latch on to the main characters.
That's what I think too.
And they were humanized. Here we have certain characters that are familiar, sort of kicking things off, and then you cut to some randos that you don't even know or care about. And you're sort of like, why do I care about these people? And the thing is, I don't. And interestingly enough, until the end of the book, I still didn't care about them as much either. So it was not that their stories were any less compelling. I think their stories were very, very compelling objectively, but subjectively to me, again, this is more a me problem. It divorced me from the whole. The same way. So
it doesn't help too that the 2 characters that are the main stars of this one, they actually have a past, and you're supposed to care about that.
Yeah, and
it's kind of like, well, we weren't there, so we kind of just don't.
And it really pales in comparison to the actual sort of folks who were the original sort of forerunners of the stories. And so on that note, it does pick up. I had to listen to it on audio to get it jump started, so thank you for that. And then and then eventually when things got to a really good place, I'm like, I am picking this book up and I'm just taking it from because it is quicker. I want to get to the meat of it and the heart of it.
I was still holding on to feelings from a year ago when Mikey read it. So when he was done, I was like, and here's all the things I needed.
So it's so interesting how this book is both the weakest and arguably the strongest link in the series for me personally.
Narratively.
Yeah.
And in terms of the lead characters, but I think it is a strong ending.
Yeah, it's exactly because there's such a definitive, satisfying end to this book.
Yes, it ends the trilogy very well.
And yeah, so by virtue of that, it sort of is up in spades, right, compared to the other 2, which sort of leaves you a little bit open-ended. Because this is the conclusion. So yes, while book 2 will always forever be my favorite, this book is the definitive conclusion, and it gets props for that. It will wind up on the list of best endings, but not necessarily best last books.
Yes.
So there's that.
To continue with the Jane Austens, we have
right.
Persuasion, which is the last one that I read actually, but I needed to put it right after Mansfield Park because it's actually my second to last that I liked on the ranking. So this one is pretty common also. I feel like a lot of people also know the premise. So Anne Elliot breaks off her engagement to Frederick Wentworth because she's persuaded that the match is going to be unworthy of her and her family.
Right.
And then the book jumps to 8 years later, where Anne is still regretting this breakup. She hasn't really entertained any thoughts of any other relationships because she's still in love with Wentworth. Sure. And then Wentworth actually comes back, and he's now a successful and rich sea captain, while she and her family are on the brink of financial ruin. And so the story is basically about, will the pair be able to forgive each other and move on from the past and move on in spite of the obstacles in their way in order to find their happily ever after. It's funny because I actually thought I was really gonna love this one, and for some reason I was just like, it was fine. I like Anne and I like Wentworth, and I do love the way that the relationship plays out. It's a kind of a second chance romance thing, obviously.
Sure.
But I just didn't really care much for the secondary characters in the story, and I think that really affected the way that I don't know, experienced it, is what I want to say. I feel like a lot of the secondary characters just caused a lot of unnecessary drama, which, to be fair, is part and parcel of the Austen stories. I feel like it's the secondary characters that end up being the source of misunderstandings or miscommunications between the main pairings in the stories. So in that sense, it fit in with the rest of Austen's work. I just felt like in this particular book, none of them were even likable or personable enough for me to be like, I enjoy this and I don't mind the drama. So I didn't end up liking this one as much as I had hoped I was going to. Right. Though I do love the iconic letter that is in this novel, I do think that that one still hit really hard. So that was an interesting experience. The next book that I want to mention is Emma, which I actually also thought I was gonna like more than I did. And I did like it, it just wasn't quite as big a hit with me as I thought it was gonna be. So Emma, our titular character, tends to think that she understands her community and the people around her very well, and she knows how to orchestrate situations so that they sort of are to the other person's advantage, or basically to fit her whims. So the novel tackles relationships both adjacent to and involving Emma herself, and the variety of misunderstandings and miscommunications that take place, and how Emma eventually learns that maybe she doesn't actually know or understand things quite as well as she thought. This one is a little more humorous and lighthearted than the other novels that Austen has written. I think Emma is a fascinating character, even though the fact that she liked to manipulate situations or was a little bit naive when it came to understanding other situations kind of grated on me sometimes. It is a pretty long and drawn out story. It kind of feels draggy at some points for me just because we were introduced in situations that were a little bit repetitive over the course of the novel. I did like the cast of characters in this one a little better than in Persuasion and in Mansfield Park. I do think they made for an entertaining group to hear about, and the drama that gets stirred up, which is mostly Emma's doing, is also a pretty compelling thing to be reading. I immediately latched onto the dynamic that Emma has with Mr. Knightley, because it's so clear from the start that those two have like something going on, some sort of rapport, and it was fun to see that like play out on the pages as well. It was entertaining for what it was, but it definitely does not make my top 3 cut for Austen's novels, unfortunately, but I'm glad I finally read it. I do like a lot of modern day retellings of Emma. I think that they're really fun. One of the ones I'm thinking of is Clueless, and I really like that a lot. And I think maybe it's because I like the modern day retelling so much that I found like a lot of the things that happen in this novel, which are obviously inhibited by the way women were perceived or treated in this time, to be less entertaining. But overall, still a good Austen.
Still a good Austen.
However, we have a surprise favorite. I did not think I was going to pick this one as one of my top Austen books, but I read Northanger Abbey and I loved it. So the star of this novel is Catherine Morland, and she's young and sweet, good-natured, naive, she likes to read, and she kind of romanticizes her own life because she has a wild imagination. So she ends up going to Bath with some family friends, and then she makes a number of new acquaintances, including the Thorpe siblings and the Tilney siblings. She gets into a number of shenanigans, I guess, along the way, some of them of her own volition as well, but eventually she learns how to discern the truth about herself, her feelings, life, and romance and love, and it is delightful. One of the things that this novel is noted for doing is being a satire of Gothic novels, and there's an entire portion of the story that just pokes fun at that, and it's really great. I like that Catherine is a reader. I love that she has a big imagination, and I kind of got swept up in sort of the fancifulness of her being so young and impressionable and just getting swept away by like this whole set of new experiences that she's having. I thought that was really fun. It was a little frustrating because you could tell right away who was manipulating her and who actually cared about her from the start, but that's part and parcel of any story, right? And I inevitably just fell in love with how this story plays out, how it concludes, like where it goes, and I definitely enjoyed it. It's actually one of the shorter Austen novels, so I was actually thinking that it might not have quite the same punch as the others, but I was clearly wrong. I take it all back. Northanger Abbey is great. I think more people should appreciate it, read it, love it as much as I do because it was so much fun. And that brings us to the end of this particular What We Read video. We hope you enjoyed hearing all our thoughts. If you have any questions, comments, feelings, all of that stuff, leave a comment down below. If you want more content from us, like this video, subscribe to the channel, check out the links down below, and we'll see you guys with a new video soon. Bye!